Hi there, class. This video will address the basic fundamentals of lighting. The essential questions you'll need to know in this video are: why is lighting important? How does lighting work? What are the pieces of lighting? So for starters, why is lighting so important? Going back to the video on line and thinking basics, you now know that lines do not exist. There are only edges created by lights and darks. And understanding how lighting works will help govern the placement of your values and also what types of values are used. By looking at this mass of cubes, we can determine where the light is coming from because it's consistent. All of the shadows fall in a particular area of this big weird looking form. Because most of the shadows are located in this region, I would say the light source is directly above. Knowing this helps you know what parts of your form to make light and what parts to make dark. The shadow placement on this piece is believable. It makes sense to us, the viewer, because the light source is planned and the shadows are consistent. There's light coming from behind the form and light coming from below the form. Likewise, in this image, the shadow placement makes the image believable because they're consistent. We can see that the light source was planned. It's coming from up and to the right. So the tops of all of these fingers will be bright. The bottoms of all the fingers will be dark. Now that you know how light works, we need to look at the pieces of lighting. And by pieces of lighting, I mean how it affects your values. What happens to your values? There are actually four major pieces to lighting. And because the lightness or darkness of a value all depends on how much light is hitting it, and because light operates on the rule that it moves in one direction, your values will almost always be used in the following ways in your piece. First of all, the highlight. The highlight encompasses your lightest values, from white to light gray. This is the part of your form where light directly hits. Only about 10% of your picture will be highlight. And if you go back to that image of the eye that I drew, look how little of the piece was white or very, very, very light. The highlight defines your form. It makes it pop. It makes it stand out. If we look solely at the hands here, the highlights would be the areas of white paper. And you see there's far, far more gray, far more pencil lead spread over the hands than there is white paper visible. It's the highlights that make the veins pop out. It's the highlights that separate the gray fingers from each other. And since highlights define your form, it's the highlights that make the sleeve pop out and not just look like a big mess of gray. It's the highlights that help the outside forearm stay separate from the rest of the shadows. It's the highlights, this teeny little highlight that separates this part of the hand from the rest of the forearm. The next piece of lighting is called the midtone. And the midtone is where light indirectly hits. Now that means there's light still hitting your form, or else you wouldn't be able to see it. But there's just enough light to make it look the way it should. And by that I mean you would see the natural, normal color of whatever you're looking at. For a red apple, the midtone would be the pure red color that you would use. The areas where the highlight would be, it would start to burn out into pink and then white, or whatever the color of the light was. In a value drawing used with just normal pencils, this would normally be your middle gray values in the piece. And the other weird thing is, this occurs the most, meaning most of your drawing, between 40 and 60% of your paper, will be your midtone. If we go over here to Mr. Escher, the midtone would be any of the gray that's used on the fingers, the hands, and starting in parts of the wrist. So by looking at the gray of this flower right here, what parts are the midtone? Well, this was a purple flower. So if we look over at the color drawing, any parts where you see purple would be where the midtone is. For the green leaves, anywhere that you see green, that would be where the midtone is. Let's go back to the black and white. Knowing where that purple was, now you can tell where the middle gray is in the flower. Look how little of white there is. It's mostly all gray, but the highlights are used to define and make it pop out, or to separate your planes. Likewise, over here in the color version, anywhere where there's white, or it starts to fade into like a light purple or a pinkish purple, that would be your highlight. So we've covered highlight, we've covered midtone. Now let's go to the third piece of lighting, that is shade. The shade is where there's the least amount of light. It also uses your darker values. Your shade accounts for 30% of your form or your drawing or your piece. And that would be your darker values, like your darker gray, your black, and so on. The shade also, like the highlight, defines your form and helps things stand out. It's the shade that helps the gray flower petals pop out. And this defines your form. That just means it makes it more visible. Same with your highlights. They define your form as well. It's the shade that helps the wrist pop out. It's the shadow in between the fingers, this dark black shadow in the negative space, that helps it pop. It's the shadow in this collar that helps this guy's cheek pop out. So highlight, midtone, shade, and now we're going to get to the fourth and final piece, the reflective light. Reflective light makes your piece believable and realistic, because that means that there is light in this room besides what's just directly hitting my face, and it's that light in the room that lights up certain other parts you'll see. The reflective light is a lighter value in the darkest areas. Let's see that again. It happens in your darkest areas, and it's caused by ambient light. Oftentimes, reflective light happens on the outside edges of a form. They are lighter than your shade, but they are darker than your highlight. Oftentimes, they're also used to separate two dark forms. If you took two dark forms in your drawing, stuck them side by side, they would blur together. They would smear together. You wouldn't be able to tell which one's in front and which one's behind. That's where reflective light comes into play. Let's look and see where we can spot reflective light on Escher's drawing. Here we have the highlight on the finger. The midtone fills out the most of the finger, what its natural shade would be in balanced light. The shade gives it definition. This light area right here on the outside of the finger, that's reflective light. Reflective light is, once again, remember, between two dark values. So we have a dark value on the finger, a dark cast shadow, and to keep those two planes from smudging together and to create an edge so that our brain could tell the difference between the finger and the ground, there is a light reflective light area right here between the two planes. Just imagine if that wasn't there, we'd have trouble telling the difference between those two areas. And so here now is a breakdown of a sphere using the parts of the values that I've taught you. We have a sphere, and the light source is coming from the upper right. The top is highlighted. The bulk of the sphere is midtone. Then we have a dark core of the shadow right down here, all right? And that accounts for about 30% of all the values in this sphere. Then we have a cast shadow on the ground. But wait, to separate the core of the shadow from the cast shadow on the ground so that we can tell the sphere is a different thing from this black ellipse down here, there is what's called reflective light on the outside. Reflective light is darker than your highlight, but lighter than your midtone, and it occurs between two dark planes. Here's a breakdown of your percentages. We have the sphere, light source coming from the upper left. 10% is your highlight. Most of it is midtone, 40 to 60. About 30% is shade, and then finally there's a little bit of reflective light down here. If you can master the sphere and the way your values spread across a sphere, you can actually shade anything. And this translates mainly to organic forms, things that are rounded, plants, animals, and so on. If we have a cube and your light source is directly above the cube, then the top of the cube would be white because that's where the light is directly hitting. It burns everything out. The areas of your cube that are indirectly hit by the light will be your midtone. The shade will be what's on the opposite side of the light. And because this cube is sitting on a surface, the shade is not visible on this cube. If you want to get really realistic, well, yeah, you would see some darker values start to take shape towards the bottom of the cube here. But for simplicity's sake, your shade will be located on the opposite side of the light. Common mistakes that beginners make involve not including all of the values. For example, putting a shade beside a highlight. Remember, your midtone rests between the highlight and the shade. Another common beginner mistake involves believing that in order to have value in a piece, all you have to do is put a few marks on it. That's not true at all. And if you ever get into a place where you're like, okay, I threw a little bit of shadows over here on my form, it's now shaded and it's done, ask yourself, do the contour lines support the drawing or do the values support the drawing? Look at this cube. The contour lines are what define and support the drawing, not the little lines right here. This mistake up here at the top is a little bit closer to accuracy because it's the darks and the lights that define the drawing. Look at this really weird form in the middle. There are no lines there. So ask yourself anytime you add value, what's supporting the drawing? And coming to a close, let's sum up how to use lighting. First of all, before you even start your value drawing, know that you need to plan your light source out. You plan your light source after your pre-drawing, but before you start to add your value. Also, make sure that the placement of your shadows lines up with the rules for how light works, or else it will just look weird. And seriously, follow those percentages for how much highlight, how much midtone, and how much shade there are. It will make your piece look believable to your viewer. And this may have seemed like a lot. Review it, go over it until you know each piece of it. You'll learn in class more and more through application how to use these. So you don't have to think of all of it at once. You can actually plan parts of it in stages, so it saves your brain energy. So answer the questions at the end of the video. I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care.
Keep blowing.